and are just some of the words that you may hear in today's podcast. Enjoy! Hello and welcome to the Perfect Information Podcast, a board game podcast of competitive potato peeling with me, Ben Maddox, and the dancer's dancer,
Yorgos Panagiotis.
Ah, 3 weeks, Georgios.
Yes, 3. More than 2, less than 4.
Since we graced the airwaves.
Is it still airwaves if it's downloaded? Oh, probably Wi-Fi. Yeah, airwaves.
Airwaves, yeah, exactly. Sure. That's why they it's actually transmitted by those chewing gums.
Chewing gums?
Yes, you know those chewing gums?
These nicotine chewing gums?
No, airwaves.
Oh, good lord.
You chew them and that transport
no.
What they don't tell us, George, just along with contrails, what they don't tell us is by buying airwaves, what you're doing is using mouth-jaw power, you're giving free network visibility to the big companies, mobile phone companies, and then they charge you for mobile phones. We're getting charged twice. 1 for the airwaves, 2 for our mouth workings, 3 for our mobile phone bills.
So you didn't actually cancel your subscription of Daily Mail then?
I use it, Georgios, because it's soft, strong, and incredibly absorbent.
Yes, but you shouldn't read it.
This week, we're talking about something we don't like to talk about.
Because we're prudes.
Well, because we like to think of ourselves above. There are some people who would focus on this and make it a reason to not like a game. They would say, well, this ain't good. The game ain't good, which we think is absurd.
Yes, because it isn't, not ain't.
And so we're talking about components. And not whether they're getting better or whether they're getting worse, but sort of the purpose of them, what they do, how they facilitate the experience of play.
And why so few of them are purple. Well, maybe not purple.
There's a lot of purple components, Georgios.
There is, yeah.
Some player colours are purple.
No.
There are some people, goths, I assume.
Goths.
Who would like to play with purple.
Or the architects. Like the guys who did all these huge buildings.
No, the people who sacked Rome in 487.
Oh, right.
Interestingly enough...
Well, they're listening to The Cure as well.
Fields of the Nephilim, mostly. Sometimes Sisters of Mercy. When they went into the temple to Venus...
Oh, that just sounds naughty.
They were playing Temple of Love by Sisters of Mercy.
Ah, that makes sense.
It does, doesn't it? Makes perfect logical sense.
Everything we say makes perfect logical sense.
I don't know what an 80s band from Leeds was doing in, Dark Ages Rome, but nevertheless, there they were, and now here we are.
I think the fact that so few people are talking about it just proves we're right.
Absolutely. So, Georgios.
Yes.
Firstly, let's start how we always start.
At the beginning, and then we skip to the end.
Indeed. By sort of defining... not what components are, because that's bloody obvious what components are, and defining that would be redundant. But what is their purpose as you see it?
Well, it's mostly functional as always. Like most of the things that we use in games, it's just the basic function of engaging us with the mechanics, or not with the mechanics, engaging us with the game experience, the play experience, transporting sometimes valuable information as to what you're supposed to do with them, with the components, how you're supposed to interact with the components, and then, of course, maybe the most important thing, they're aesthetically pleasing. Because at the end of the day, games are about pleasure, and most of it is aesthetic.
Well, it's interesting. Firstly, I mean, that's obviously wrong. But
obviously.
It seems to me that components have 2 basic functions. One is their, I guess, aide de memoire is they track your progress through a game. They're on tracks, they're on spaces, so when it comes to your turn, you know where you are, or you know where other people are in relation to you. I mean, that's the practical application of a component, right?
Well, they're basically a manifestation of gaming relations. Basically, you have this much we.
Sure. Exactly. Then you have the other side, which is the aesthetic side. Components are actively used to draw you into the game, to invite you into playing it. Now, whether this be beautifully, ornately carved jade chess pieces, and the sheer sort of tactility is there to encourage you to continue to play the game, or whether these be sculpted miniatures that want to evoke the theme of the game and draw you into the story of the game. I think that is one side.
But I think that's an interesting distinction you're making here, because well, maybe it's not a distinction you're making, but that I want to make is that yes, to some extent they do draw you in, but also, especially with sculpted miniatures, especially with the quality of miniatures that we've seen in the last couple of years, they become to some extent an end in and of themselves. Because, especially Kickstarter games with their huge numbers of pretty looking miniatures selling like crazy. The miniatures themselves, the way they look, how you can paint them, how you can make them even more appealing to you, become somehow tacked on to the value of the game itself. It's not just the game itself, the gameplay itself that's supposed to provide enjoyment. It's also the fact that you have beautiful miniatures that you can place on the board that you can look at. You have, like in Scythe, because I just remembered it, you have this huge board you could optionally buy that makes it even more appealing, even more engaging. And I think to some extent components, now that we've forgotten the 90s and moved past just basic wooden tokens and into more elaborate pieces, become something of their own purpose.
Well, it's interesting because you said in your initial sort of sum up, right?
Yes.
The most important aspect, the aesthetics. Mm-hmm. I don't agree with you that it's the most important aspect. I don't think it's either the least important aspect. Right. I think it's vital, but you can't, the game does not work without an ability to track the state of the game. And that's the primary purpose for components, is to track the state of the game, where you are in relation to other players, where you are in relation to your own scores, how much stuff and games don't work without that. Yeah. That's the, don't pull that expression, but that's, I'm sorry, but, I mean, without any way of tracking the state of the game, because we don't have analog games,
yes,
don't have RAM to store things and to pop up random game states and stuff. That's the purpose of components. I don't think the aesthetic value is any less important than that. Mm-hmm. But I certainly don't think it's more important than that, because without that function of the component, the game breaks down. Unless you have an eidetic memory and can remember the game state, then why play a game on a board at all? You can just play it in your heads.
Well, I think the only thing I'm not sure about is whether you can easily separate the two. Whether the aesthetic isn't also overlapping with how it functions within the game, how it, like I said earlier, manifests certain relations, how it tracks certain numbers. I think one of the appealing aspects of board games is that those two levels are merged.
But I think they can be exclusive. So for instance,
sure, they can be, but they can be merged as well.
Take the example of how any game gets developed. And we know about this at the moment because we've been playtesting the new Watch Your game, right?
Yes.
So for the most part, there are certain exceptions that people would point out, but for the most part, prototypes don't have finished components, right, don't have beautiful miniatures and sculpted, beautiful, tactile wooden pieces. They don't have them. Mm-hmm. Yet the game can be actively engaged with and actively played. Now, I don't doubt that the addition of then beautiful components improves the immersion and therefore improves the enjoyment. But as simple tracking mechanisms, you can use anything, literally any board game. You can photocopy something on a sheet of paper. You can render the board down to a grid.
Yeah.
And then you can take tokens and you can just write on the piece of paper, blah, 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 and you can play that game. You can.
That is true.
So they can be separated into those two camps.
But the point, I just point out that the black market for bootleg copies of board games just consisting of tokens, simple tokens, like your own homemade version of some fancy board game, like Scythe maybe, because, it's a hot thing right now. If somebody were to make their own bootleg version of Scythe, not spending lots of money on miniatures, on a beautiful artwork and anything like that, just copying the pure mechanisms, you don't see a huge market for that kind of bootleg game, because at the end of the day, the addition of aesthetics is vital to our enjoyment of games.
I absolutely fundamentally agree with you. I was just making a philosophical distinction for the sort of purposes of argument. Now, I absolutely agree with you. And this is the interesting thing. And it's something when I first got into gaming, there was a lad who would regularly come to the game group, young lad, and he would say, "Oh, do you have this game?" And I would say, "No." He goes, "Oh, well, I'll just mock up a copy. Right. I'll just photocopy, put some pieces of paper, and we can just play that." And I was like, well, firstly, that's a bit rough because it's pirating. And I've never pirated in my life. Secondly, I don't want to play a fucking A4 sheet of paper with some wooden tokens on it. I want to play the game because that's what components do. They are the tangible link between you and the construction of the game.
Yeah, exactly.
They transmit the game into your fingers, right?
Yeah, they're basically they are the medium itself. And if you want to argue that maybe the rules are the way the medium sort of functions, but the components themselves are the medium. And again, I believe this aesthetic pleasure. That's why I mentioned. That's why I emphasize the aesthetic pleasure, because if you remove this, you end up at best with the kind of minimalist art or simple components you would have in the early 90s, which I respect a lot of people have an affection for. But if you're looking like a broad spectrum of people who might be interested in games, I think lively art, maybe even more realistic, or at least more colorful, more engaging, more interesting, or even more, just generally more ambitious art. I keep talking about Scythe for some reason.
Well, Scythe is the obvious one to talk about because, whether you like the game or not, you cannot deny it in terms of its just visual.
Yeah, exactly.
Visual magnetic attraction.
Exactly.
It's almost at the pinnacle at the moment of the hobby, right?
Well, right now it's very much, drawing a lot of attention to it. And I think it's a nice example of how aesthetics, as I believe, are vitally important to the success of a game. Again, there are people who appreciate like the more minimalistic arts of the early 90s, like small wooden discs and small wooden whatevers, which is fine. But I think the majority of gamers today want something that's not just pretty to look at, but just aesthetically pleasing. Just, it does something to you. It invites you to touch it, to get involved with it, to figure out, to wonder out, how do I use this? What's the fun that's hidden within this game?
Well, it's like that thing, isn't it? That people say, oh, well, personality is the most important thing. And I guess I kind of believe that to some degree, but the fact is we're visual animals.
Yeah.
Right? And so our interaction with the world is based through what we see. Mostly.
Sometimes what we touch or who, but yes.
Yeah. And of course then, the other senses kick in, but it's primarily visual. And so things that attract us are things that attract us visually primarily. And that's the purpose not only of the art, which I think is part of the components, essentially.
Oh yeah.
Not only the art, but also the components. And when you couple that in with the pure tactile enjoyment of touching these things, the heft of something in your hand, and whether this be plastic or wood or whatever. And I think, within the gaming world, it's sort of divided between it's still divided between Euro gamers and Ameritrashers,
Historically grown.
And all of that is vital to the enjoyment of a game. Yet, I fight with myself. Because I've been playing this Watch Your Game prototype now for 3 months. And it's really good.
Yes.
And we've been playing with basic cubes, basic discs, a photocopied map, no finished components, nowhere near, yet the game is really great.
Yeah.
And so I can't reconcile those two things in my head. And I'll be very interested, because I've never been through the playtest period of a game before. I'll be really interested to see when I actually do play it, whether I enjoy it more for having the nice pieces.
Yeah, I think this...
Or is that a false distinction to draw?
I think you might be setting yourself up for basically validating your own bias. And that, I think, our history with this prototype, and the fact that we've seen it go through various iterations, and some of them worked, some of them didn't work. We just know the game almost inside out by now. The addition of better components does not have the same effect on us now as it does on somebody who's new to the game. Because to them, the mechanics and the components and the aesthetic level all coincide. To us, it's just an addition. To us, it's basically... Imagine playing, playing 51st State just as a card game, and then you rebuy this game as the new master set. It's prettier. It's sleeker. Some of the edges are worn off, but it does not give you the same rush as the person who buys the master set for the first time. What I'm trying to say is, I think if you were to now compare your experience before components and after components, I think you won't see much of a difference. I think because as you said, aesthetics are so intrinsically linked to our experience of the game that if you know the game already, the new components just work differently.
So, that leads us on quite handily. This is the term I've been hearing a lot recently, and this has been thrown at Abyss, and now has been thrown at Oceanos, that it's overproduced. And this is where it's interesting. It seems that components are an active detriment, and not just financial. Now, the obvious financial detriment where you're getting a game that's essentially a deck of cards, but because they wanted to spice it up with nice components, you're paying an extra 10, 15 quid.
I think it's the other way around.
For something.
I think because they wanted 10 or 15 quid more, they spice it up with components. That's I think, the argument. That's basically the criticism.
Right. That's the obvious one. But right. There's something slightly more sort of aesthetic in this. Basically, components imply something about a game.
Yes.
They imply a complexity and a depth.
Yes.
And then if you then have this game that takes 15 minutes to set up and it's great and it's a ding, ding, ding trick-taking card game, you think, well, why have we got all these bloody components?
Exactly.
I bought this game because I thought it was going to be a complex strategy game because of all the bits in it. And now it's a ding, ding, ding trick-taking card game.
Yeah.
So I think in that sense, not in a financial sense, although that's part of it, but just in an expectation sense, components, good components can be a detriment to a game, right?
Oh, no, totally. I think, like I mentioned earlier, components are manifestation of gameplay. They're basically the physical abilities, they're artifacts, the visually tactile artifacts that you can put into your hand, you can play around with, that transport the idea of what you're playing. Which is why theme often comes up when people talk about components. Because, like I mentioned earlier, theme to me is like the closely tied to the experience. And if the components transport the experience, sort of suggest what kind of experience you're having, like what kind of game you're playing, then those components are going to be highly rated. But if those components just seem strange and
incongruous with the game you're playing.
Exactly. I'm reminded, I don't want to bag on the game because I'm not using it as a criticism, it just popped into my head. But I remember thinking about Dogs of War, that the busts that you play with are huge and kind of unwieldy, and I felt something of a disconnect between the game I experienced and the game I saw.
Is that because the game's overproduced, or is that because with a game of that nature you expect components of that nature and they're appropriating components from another style of game and popping it into this one?
I think it's the latter. I think it's the fact that for some reason the components as they are in Dogs of War don't seem to fit with the gameplay. I had my issues with some elements of the game, but I don't think it's a bad game. I think but the components just I couldn't wrap my head around how this kind of odd looking, fancy looking, almost humorous looking game was so deeply cutthroat. And that disconnect sort of, was weird to me. Whereas other games, they just fit. I mean, many licensed games work fairly well in that, many licensed games allow you to be very passive about what you do.
It's interesting that you have this disconnect between the components and the game. And if you have this disconnect between the components of the game, then you tend to be disappointed. But I think this leads to a greater question, right? I think that hobby board gaming, especially, is moving in a different direction.
Okay.
Because I think you notice now, and I think the advent of Kickstarter really contributes to this. What you're noticing is games are getting more and more elaborate. Games are getting more and more boutique is the word I use, right? That they're specific sort of almost art projects, from the game design to the physical art on the board to the components. They all come together to create this well-being generating thing. And the game is only one part of that.
Yes, exactly. I think it's quite fascinating how it grew out of Kickstarter, because it became quite apparent early on in Kickstarter's board game search that games that offer miniatures, lots of miniatures, pretty looking miniatures, would get funded easily quickly and, far above the funding level. So this became a route that lots of publishers took. We have this game and we're including miniatures. And if we get this stretch go, we're including more miniatures and more miniatures. And apparently a lot of backers love this kind of stuff. Now it's slowly becoming an established trope of Kickstarter games that they provide a lot of miniatures, a lot of fancy looking miniatures. Something like Cthulhu Wars or probably Glorantha as well. These huge bigatures even. And at some point I also wondered how is the game even the point anymore? Isn't the point of something like Cthulhu Wars to have it on your table and display it and say, look, this is the fancy little thing I own, and less about let's play this game because the experience of playing this game will be fun for the group.
Well, that's interesting because that leads into a lot of criticism, sort of in this idea that, because there is this idea amongst a certain type of gamer who plays a certain type of game that they play the pure game, right? They play the game, they're playing the games for the games.
Yeah.
There is, and I fall into this sometimes, this idea that, all of this chrome lay over the top is there to distract you from the fact there's very little game there. And I think that has been in the past.
Yes,
quite true.
There have been games that, did work like that. Yeah.
And I think Cthulhu Wars, I haven't played it but from what I hear, it's a watered down version of Chaos in the Old World.
I don't know enough about that.
And, it seems to me that the point of that game is the bigatures in the game. It's not the game itself.
Yes, but interestingly enough, and I think this is something that's easily dismissed, but there's something appealing about a board game being a hobby indulgence.
But doesn't Cthulhu Wars, for instance, as an example, seem decadent to you?
Yes, but that's the point.
But the point is, though, doesn't it seem like it's a distraction from the hobby as a whole? That it seems this teenage boy's wet dream about having as many toys on the table as possible and makes it look like a childish pursuit. Doesn't I look at Cthulhu Wars and I think you are tapping in, for whatever reason, to this adolescent nostalgia for toys. Cthulhu Wars is a toy. I don't see games as toys.
I don't have an issue with that. I think the toy aspect, the toy facet of games is legitimate, is fair, and I still love playing with toys. I mean, I have a son, so I have an excuse, but I like the toy aspects of big, huge board games. I remember playing Twilight Imperium a while back, and one of the players actually just after the game telling me, it has its flaws, but it's just so much of it. There's just so much there, so decadent, so opulent, and just playing with so much stuff is just fun. Simple fun, simply enjoyable to have all this stuff laid out in front of you that you control. And that's just something, it just makes me smile just thinking about it. I think the indulgence, the toy character is legitimate. I would agree with you when we talk about these kind of games. If these kind of games were somehow the core of the hobby instead of outliers, then yes, that would be a detriment. That would be distracting from the core experience. But I don't think that's true. I think these kind of opulent games, overproduced in a way games, have the niche, have the people who are willing to spend money for them, who want to have this huge toy on the table. I think that's fine, but I do wonder sometimes whether this is a direction that the entire hobby is going to devolve into.
I believe it's a devolution. I mean, it's that point, isn't it? I think in any aspect of human culture, right, whether that be sport, whether that be the arts, whether that be science, there is a desire to follow and ape what is successful.
Yeah, sure.
And we see this in board games, right? Since Kickstarter, since the inclusion of lots of miniatures, we've seen now the rise of companies like Cool Mini or Not, Fantasy Flight really upping the game with miniatures, having miniatures in everything.
Well, having a business model that sells people individual miniatures and calling them expansions, yes.
And I think Scythe is very important for one reason. Because we've talked about hybrid Euro Ameritrash games, but I think Scythe is the first Euro game that has an extensive, now this might be absolute tripe, but has an extensive focus on miniatures, right? Not just plastic components, but miniatures in the sort of miniature game sense, right? And I feel that the example of Scythe is going to push games towards that direction. And I think, and I'm uncomfortable with the fact, especially because I like wooden components, but I'm uncomfortable with the fact that something pure, like Through the Ages, which is cards and the interplay of cards, is going to be diluted by the inclusion of bloody dolls, essentially. And I see the game going in that direction, and that's a concern for me, because I like the efficient simplicity of games that want you to notice the game and not the dolls you're putting on the board.
I feel like the exact opposite. I'm slightly worried about this focus on miniatures and stuff to play with might eventually draw away focus from the experience itself. But I feel, especially when you brought up both Scythe and Through the Ages, and I had something of an opposite reaction to those. I thought Through the Ages, I played the old version. I'm told the new version is essentially the same with some mostly cosmetic changes. I feel let down that it's essentially a card game. I feel let down that it's mostly about shifting cards around, paying there, putting cards here. I want there to be more.
You're wrong, but carry on.
No, I'm not. It's a personal preference. But
your personal preferences are wrong.
Right. Basically,
they've done a scientific experiment. They did a scientific experiment.
They did, yes.
And they told me that your personal preferences are objectively wrong.
Do they only talk to you?
They only talk to me.
I thought so. Anyway, but with Scythe, I thought the addition of miniatures sort of made this game more attractive to me, even though I was let down, but I didn't enjoy the gameplay itself. But the miniatures, the way it when laid out on the table, even though I knew I wasn't going to really enjoy the game, once I saw it set up, I thought maybe I'll give it another try, because this looks quite fun. Then I sat down and anyway, but so what I'm trying to say is that I kind of see a similar development, but I don't think it's a devolution. I don't think it's a danger to anything. I don't think it dilutes the gameplay itself. I think it enhances it. I think it embraces the playful nature of games, which I think is something that can get easily forgotten. And I wouldn't go so far as to say I welcome this kind of development, but I'm not opposed to it. If it, even though I can live with Cthulhu Wars and Glorantha being, specialist types of games, and, for the normal people, we just have pretty miniatures and that's it. If somebody wants to shell out 500 euros, dollars, or whatever currency to have like 200 figures on the table, more power to them. But as long as we have a strong mainstream core of games that just look pretty and have a certain playful character to them, then I see it as a benefit to the hobby as a whole.
You see, and this is the point. I think play can be differentiated. I think adult play can be differentiated from childhood play. I think focused cognitive play is, for me, more valuable than fucking toys. And I worry that in the future, all I'm going to be able to buy are toys. And not only that, expensive toys too. And I think the removal of plastic from a game may be a good thing.
No. You need to be able to play.
Rules are not meant to be fun, and we all hate them. Rules is stupid. I'm TC Petty III, and this is Deep Design with TC Petty III. Obey the rules. This week, I've been revising and revisiting several sets of rules for super awesome 2nd edition printings. So I thought it'd be a great opportunity for you to listen to me explain all that I have learned and more about a subject that is marginally more entertaining than contracting a venereal disease. Why do we have bad rules? Let's start out with a quick reminder. Everyone is fucking terrible at writing rules. You are, your dead mom is, your dead father is. Even people who get paid to revise rules, which are few and we desperately need more companies willing to spend that money, they kind of blow too. I'm not good at writing rules, but apparently no one is. In fact, if it is even possible, the embarrassing shit stain of a rulebook I wrote for Viva Java the Coffee Game, the Dice Game, was actually made worse when it was translated to German. And I can't think of a time in history when Germans made anything worse. Rules are the last thing a company or designer wants to think about, because you know why. They suck. They suck to write. They take time. They're work. They require revisions. They require blind playtesting to be most effective. Companies have to take the time and energy to do this with every single game create. It's easy not to. And they have to make sure that they have this in their schedule for each game cycle of production. And so, because of inexperience, disinterest, lack of knowledge of basic standards, lack of investment, egos, and the varying subjective tastes of consumers, we have bad rulebooks. It used to be so easy. Games weren't complex. Entire rules documents were printed on the box lid from the late 1800s to the 1970s, and in the most rare cases, when some insane designer made a game destined to fail, the rules were printed on the front and back of a single sheet of paper, and it was scandalous. If there was a fold in that paper to allow for 4 pages, they got out the straitjacket and escorted them to the nearest asylum. This began to change a little with the onset of war games and simulation, and further was explored when companies like Avalon Hill began printing games for the underground hobby market in the 1970s, and games like Dungeons & Dragons were created. These games desperately required booklets and binders, and began the fantastic tradition of rules numbering and rules subsections and tables and endless blocks of eye-gouging text blobs in columns. And in the modern day, we have these weird things called computers. And these computers both allow consumers and publishers to create all kinds of tools on the internet to help with learning even the most complex games. And the color. Glorious color was introduced to printing techniques sometime in the 1980s, which allowed for illustration and pastel textures to help beautify all this boring text. So now everything is perfect and easy, and there are literally no excuses. And rulebooks still suck. So even though I absolutely deplore stooping to Rules Writing 101, or any 101 class at all, let's begin by providing you with the most standard modern rulebook layout.
Standardized modern rulebook layout.
Provide a thematically flavored paragraph or 2 of text that gives the backstory of the game and clearly defines the player's goals in an appropriately thematic way. This is important as it will frame the entire experience for many player types and needs to be engaging. Explain how the game is set up. Provide a table of contents for the different sections of the rulebook, which also includes a listing of components within the game box. Use pictures when possible during setup, showing exactly what a standard starting setup looks like, and naming each important piece. Describe which components are given to players individually, and which components are kept in a general supply. If there are any special rules for setup, make sure to present them in a logical step-by-step order. Explain how to win and how the game ends in concrete mechanical terms. No flowery language. Be direct and functional. I'll pause real quickly here to say that the 3 parts I just listed, their order can be rearranged, but they are the absolute most important information and should therefore be provided up front as quickly as possible. Theme, setup, how to win. Then give an overview of gameplay, providing a brief synopsis of a player's turn or a round of play depending on the type of game. This should be brief, should introduce the basic mechanical function of gameplay and how it relates to the theme. If there is a special concept that your game hinges on, explain it now before diving into gameplay proper. Then, detail the steps of each turn or round, providing in the most concrete and consistent terms how to play the game. Start with the beginning of a turn or round and move in chronological order to what will trigger the end of a turn or round. Explain what a player may do on their turn and what a player may not do on their turn. Again, if there is an action that is extremely important or a mechanic that gameplay hinges on, explain it in detail, provide examples of its use, and do not be afraid to explain it again a second time. Exactly like I just did right here. Then, reiterate how the game ends and how to win. If there are any strange exceptions or tiebreaker rules, this is the place to state them, not at the beginning of the rulebook. Provide an example of scoring if possible. And finally, after re-explaining how the game ends, provide a section or 2 that will aid in avoiding players having to flip through the rules themselves to try and find a specific rule during gameplay. These sections include helpful exceptions or an FAQ that details important rules that players might forget. It shouldn't be long, but it should be answers to questions that have popped up during blind playtesting. Provide a glossary of terms for keywords and concepts that may pop up in your game. If your game does not have keywords, it may require a glossary to explain special icons used in the game. Either way, it's helpful to have a quick reference for anything that might need a refresher when returning to the game after not having played for a while. And of course, provide any variants, errata, links, or advertisement in this area. basically stuff that is specific or extra that players will probably not need during their first play. Dump it all in the back. If at all possible, use the back page of the rulebook as a player aid for convenient reminders during the game. It's not required, but it's a nice addition to a complex game, and players will thank you for it. Phew. Well, that was easy. Thanks for listening to the Deep Design Podcast with TC Petty III. Like, subscribe, hit me up on Twitter as @PuppyShogun for the latest... No! We have totally not even begun. Alright, I'm not saying that this is the only way that rules can be done. I'm just introducing the standard format so that you can feel comfortable writing in a specifically expected way for most every rules decipherer on the planet. Joe Walensky was part of a company that performed usability tests on booklets promoting the ACT test to high school students. For the international audience, the ACT is like the inbred cousin of the SAT in America. Colleges look at the SAT score as a standard and view the ACT as a greasy reach around behind an Arby's dumpster. This may or may not be true, but that's not exactly important, nor is what they discovered, but the important part is the proposed implementation. There were portions of the pamphlet that students remembered and focused upon as important. Things like, should you test again? How do colleges use the results? And how the ACT figures out your scores. Other portions were materials that they could care less about, like ordering additional score reports, paying for college, finding the right college, as these are somewhat related and good to know, but aren't important to anxious test takers taking the ACT. So Joe and his team offered the most obvious advice possible. Make sure that the most important information is the most visible and clear. Also, put it right up front so that the reader doesn't lose interest. I'm only relaying the story to prove that the format of a standard rulebook proposed does exactly that. Puts the most important learning tools up front and then expands from there. And I'm also relaying the story to prove that I'm right. The Space Alert problem. But what about narrative rulebooks, TC? Some people opine that learning a game can be fun too. Aw, that's so cute. And terribly naive. Just look at Crossmaster Arena, an entry-level miniature-based combat game that actually allows players to learn the game step by step by placing their figures on and playing scenarios in the actual rulebook. It creates a sort of narrative rulebook structure that teaches you some rules at a time so that you're not overwhelmed on your first game. Space Alert does this as well. That's by Vlada Kavatal, TC. Vlada Kavatal's a genius. Bullshit. Now, Vlada is undoubtedly a genius, but learning a game by piecemeal through the use of multiple scenarios that increase the number of rules with each successive game has its own fair share of problems, and it's not, quote, fun. But the most important one, it takes 800 times longer to actually learn the game this way. I own Space Alert. I have never actually played a full game of Space Alert, but you know what I have played? The goddamn introductory scenarios at least 5 fucking times, because people lose interest. We all have short attention spans, and playing the game 4 or more times before actually playing the game is madness. It's about 2 hours of learning for a game that takes less than 30 minutes to play. So if you decide to go this route, which admittedly can work and is almost required for a real-time game with so many moving parts as Space Alert, just please use the rule of 3. 3 tutorial scenarios at most. The game Mythic Battles had like 13. 13! It's not even that bad of a game, but I wouldn't know because I only made it through 1. The 70s War Game Rulebook. But TC, what about referencing rules? The best way to have players reference rules is to have clearly delineated sections and subsections with several glossaries and table of contents for keywords so that I know that movement exceptions are in movement section 12.3.5b. I think the answer here is this. How stupid do you assume your audience is? I'm not saying wargamers are smart. They just have a high tolerance for rules written like the agreement terms to downloading iTunes. They sacrifice a lot of readability for usability as long as simulation is achieved. But most people are pretty dumb, and people have short attention spans, which is why I talk so fast on this segment. But it all leads to the rules paradox. The rules paradox. The rules paradox. If you make rules fun, they're hard to reference. If you make rules easy to reference, they're hard to read. The absolute goal of a rulebook is to explain to a player how to play the game with all the correct rules. While this means it's not to entertain the player, if you don't engage the reader, they will not retain the information, and therefore the rules do not achieve their desired purpose. Wargame rulebooks and Avalon Hill rulebooks from the 70s are outdated. They are to be used as sources of inspiration, not to be directly copied. And pretty much nobody prints their rules on a box lid anymore. The goal is to create a modern rulebook that relays information in the most direct and visually stimulating way possible. To be concrete and consistent while also being concise. This means a marriage of functionality and form that should be highly expected and standardized, while offering a flamboyance that's all its own. The greatest part about writing rules is that the quality of your rules is evaluated on a completely subjective scale by literally every idiot that's ever read words. And that's why I couldn't actually finish any of what I wanted to actually say in this goddamn 10-minute segment, so I have to split it up into 2 parts. Which is absolutely evil, and I hate every second of this. So stay tuned for part 2, which is a ridiculously long rapid-fire list of tips and tricks with really exciting things like double coding and proper typefaces to make your rulebook not suck so much.
Is that your name on the list? Well, get in there then. Get to the bar and get buckled. Welcome to the guild. Ooh, Georgiosity.
Are you sitting on one of those weird chairs with a thumb sticking up?
I mean, I am, but that's not the reason I'm so gleeful today, right. Georgios.
Then why are you so gleeful today?
Well, you know, there's been a cloud following me, Georgios, for the past few weeks and that.
Right, but you signed up to Google.
The loss of our... That's... What? The loss of our guild. The loss of fair Janine.
Oh, yeah, actually, I saw her today.
She's just over there. Shut up.
At the reception.
What reception?
With a glass of wine in her hand.
What reception?
No, she was talking to some guy.
What bloody reception are you going to? Where Janine's going to? What bloody reception?
At her feet was this.
Do you hate me?
This footloose man.
What are you trying to bring me down?
What I'm trying to say is, you can't always get what you want.
Well, that's interesting, because, as you know, I'm now a full member of Tension and Release.
I've heard that you are a full member, yeah.
The German techno act that practices here at the guild. Well, they actually recently did a full techno version of You Can't Always Get What You Want by the Rolling Stones.
Right.
And we played our first gig.
Right.
And they loved us, Georgios. They loved us. They were clapping and screaming and dancing and now...
Slapping bass.
To be fair...
Yeah.
A lot of them were on drugs. A lot of them were on mind-altering psychotropic drugs, Georgios.
Well, some would argue alcohol does the same thing, so I think you're fine.
But yeah, and we debuted. That's the word. Debuted.
Yeah, I see.
My new song that I wrote about Janine with a mouth harp in it. Yeah, I do a mouth harp solo.
Excellent.
And they really enjoyed it. And they said, wow. And there was people crying, Georgios. People crying. Some woman was screaming.
I bet. Yeah.
And I my plan is to get old T&R down here.
Okay, down here, yeah.
And speak to Johan, see if we can have a gig here. When Janine's working, and then I'll play the song. And honestly, I can't imagine that I won't win her heart back, Georgios.
Yes, but I've always mentioned you have a certain lack of imagination.
I like to consider myself immune to intellectual thought.
I think a lot of people do that.
So anyway, last week's question, well, not last week, it was quite a long time ago.
Yes.
3 weeks. I've played a gig with T&R since then, and, they loved me.
I've been to a reception.
Anyway, what are your board game masterpieces? Mm-hmm. And we had some nice... There was a lot of people in the guild. A lot of people came to the guild.
Yes. See, once you ask people of their opinions, they will not shut up about it.
Well, I think those test tube cocktails... That shows me my age, doesn't it? Those test tube cocktails, Georgios, attracted people quite extensively.
Yeah, probably. I'm quite certain that was the reason why everybody came.
2 for 1? 2 for 1 on pink fizz?
Yeah. Well, actually, someone was selling milkshakes in the yard. She was like saying, "Ooh."
A lot of boys went there.
A lot of boys.
She offered to teach me something, but she told me she'd have to charge me, Georgios, and frankly, I don't have those kinds of monies.
Yeah.
If her milkshake manufacture was anything to go by.
That is true.
And so we got a lot of responses, and it was not just, oh, here's a game, but it was also a discussion on the concept of masterpieces themselves, which I thought was nice.
Yes, it sort of takes the onus off our backs to come up with anything insightful, witty, or even coherent.
As I said, immune to intellectual thought.
All right.
So, we open up with the number one man in British board gaming,
Bob Geldof.
Tony Boydell.
So not Bob Geldof.
Because Tony Boydell does like Mondays. And lasagna, though. I never thought those two things went together.
I think it makes sense. We release on Mondays. That probably makes sense why Bob Geldof doesn't actually, respond to any of my emails.
Well, I've heard since we started releasing the podcast on Mondays, Georgios.
Yes.
Bob Geldof hasn't played that song live since. Maybe we've changed his mind about Mondays, Georgios.
We probably have.
Bob, if that's true, just pop on the guild, write us a message. All right, there, boys. I don't mind Mondays now. Bloody, I'm not doing Live Aid again. Accents.
I can sort of see why the Irish are not fond of the Brexit vote now.
So, anyway, Tony talks about Agricola.
Yes, he does.
And he gives a lot of reasons for this.
He does.
But also he talks about how Agricola, as opposed to Caverna, is a much more rigorous intellectual pursuit. It's more difficult to become good, it's more difficult to play, it's tenser and less forgiving. Mm-hmm. Which leads to the question, do masterpieces have to be inherently complex or complicated to be masterpieces? Can simple things be masterpieces, or do we devalue the simple at our peril?
I think we are, as board gamers, we are poised to both overestimate and overvalue our intellectual capacity. As such, we are easily prone to elitism, meaning that we are more likely to believe something that is difficult is better than something that isn't.
That's not unique to board games, though, is it? That's unique to all facets of culture, right?
Possibly, but I'm fairly well-versed in board game culture and not that well-versed in, say, pop culture or drum and bass.
Yeah, but you've read a book and that, haven't you? And you know that some of the well-established sort of... Infinite Jest is a great example, a sort of modern masterpiece. Considered a modern masterpiece, at least. I'm trying to read it at the moment, bloody artwork. Mm-hmm. But wonderfully, beautifully written, but hard, difficult, opaque. And people hold that up as the sort of standard for masterpieces.
I'm going to name drop some books that I enjoy, which is, I'm always fond of, hard-boiled fiction, modernist stuff. I really like Ulysses. I really, really do.
It is very good, actually.
It is fantastic.
I haven't read it. I've only read the first sort of third of it, but again, difficult, opaque.
See, I think this is really interesting because this actually almost ties back into our actual topic, in that with Ulysses, I didn't find it difficult to read. I'm sure there's depths that I haven't actually, dove into, things that just went past my head. But the act of just enjoying the book itself was so immediate, so simple, so just the joy of reading, just experiencing this book was there. That's why I enjoyed this book so much. And I feel the same way about games, regardless of how complex they are. If I feel I got a way into that, if the fun is apparent to me, if I don't really care how complicated it is. I didn't care how complicated Madeira was. I didn't really care how convoluted Twilight Imperium is. Both of those games just immediately hit me and generate fun.
Well, this is the interesting thing, isn't it? Because it's sometimes not the message, but the way the message is conveyed.
Yeah, sure.
And sometimes the core can be very simple. I think Ulysses is actually very approachable in the sense of what he's saying.
Yeah.
Is very much sort of the concerns of normal people, but the way it's delivered to you can sometimes seem daunting. And I think games have this. It can sometimes seem daunting. And Agricola, for instance, can seem daunting. I think
that's an interesting follow-up question, though. Does the reputation of a work as a masterpiece somehow intimidate people into expecting or into trying harder, expecting more, looking for something, looking past what's obvious? Like something like if somebody were to say, well, we said Codenames is a masterpiece. If somebody were to sit down based on our recommendation or similar recommendation, play the game, and then expect more than it is, which is just clever, immediate, fun, and something that sucks you in, but it doesn't give you it doesn't necessarily give you deep strategic depth or long-term investment or what have you. It's just a small gem of a game that's just brilliantly compact. Doesn't the term masterpiece somehow push games, imply the kind of challenge that you mentioned earlier, that the masterpiece needs to be difficult?
Well, this is the point, and I don't know. Anyway, let's move on to Prodigy.
Well, apparently he still
hasn't said anything, so it's got to be right. Prodigy.
I'm quite okay. Let's go with that.
I'll put on the racist accent. Prodigy.
Which racist accent was that?
I don't know, generic Northern European or something, isn't it?
All right, fine.
So, read what he says about toi, because I'm interested in what he says about toi.
See, if you pronounce it like that, it does sound like toi.
Toi.
Alright, I'm going to pronounce it toi because I looked it up on the internet and I believe everything that I read. A masterpiece. I'm just going to quote because obviously we did a lot of research and I can't be bothered to go into it. Representing a masterpiece, including so many different mechanics, of which not all are represented in every game. An integrated theme in all major aspects, variability, and a bit of co-op. No runaway leader issues. Quite quick to set up. Works good with any number of players. Beautiful art. Components are what they should be. He has obviously not listened to our topic yet.
Indeed.
And the box size is perfect. And the dice purchase mechanics are brilliant.
And what's interesting about this is not particularly what he says, although I think all of those reasons... No, I don't mean that in a rude way. I'm sure all of those reasons factor in. But what he's focused on, which a lot of people don't, and which sometimes we both fall prey to when we think about narrative, he's talking about simple game elements. He's not talking about the story it tells or any sort of wider arc. He's talking about the way the elements of the game focus in to make it a masterpiece in a purely game form. A unique masterpiece that is judged on its gameplay, not by the same rubric that we judge books or films or whatever. And I think that's interesting.
Yeah, I wouldn't agree with you that we fall prey to this. I think, at least on my part, it's a fairly conscious decision not to focus on these things because I don't think...
Well, you don't like games, really, do you?
That is true.
You like books, and you expect games to deliver the same thing that books do, which they shouldn't be expected to, in my opinion.
Yes, you've successfully put up an argument I never made and defeated it. Well done.
Thank you very much.
I think that's just really the cogs of the machine. The mechanics are the cogs of the machine of the gameplay experience, and I think the experience is essential. And I do agree to a certain extent that focusing on narrative is also kind of missing the forest for the trees in a way.
But what he's saying is the experience is brought out of the cogs of the machine.
Yes, but unfortunately he doesn't... I'm going to be self-indulgent here, but one of the reasons we do the reviews the way we do them is because we want to focus on the experience, because the experience is basically the sum of narrative and mechanics. And I think... And while I would love to hear more from Mr. F...
Freudian, if that's pronounced, John.
Right. About the experience of Trois, because which to him I'm sure makes it a masterpiece. Just listing the various ways in which the mechanics are well done does not yet convince me of its status as a masterpiece.
That's true, but you can't... The point is, games are so experiential.
Yeah.
That you can't judge that until you've played it. All they are is a list of mechanics. All they are is a rule book until you've played it. And this is why a lot of people who say, I can read a rule book and I can tell you whether the game is good, are not telling the truth.
Oh, I think they're convinced they're telling the truth, but I think they're wrong, yeah.
Right. Anyway, let's move on to Phil.
Yes. Mr... Wait, no, actually, I will try to actually pronounce his proper name.
Okay.
Which is Bob.
I didn't realise that Bob was spelt Phil.
It's actually spelled Patrick, but it's a very, very little known rural accent.
Is it one of those
North Dakota, I believe?
Oh right, I thought it was one of those Gaelic things.
Possibly, it might have originated from there. But Bob.
So what does Bob say?
Bob suggests that he immediately thought of El Grande. Again, the proper pronunciation.
All the accents.
The proper pronunciation, and not at all racist. And he argues that the longevity of the game speaks for it being a masterpiece, which is an interesting argument to make, I believe.
Longevity, define longevity. How long it's been around, I think.
Yes, not how long it lasts, because by that metric, Twilight
Imperium would be a masterpiece, and let's be frank.
It is, but not for that reason.
So, and this leads into the comment that our good friend Peter D. Duck Warp made.
Yeah, we're all about the D here.
And he said, what is a masterpiece? I think it needs at least a generation to pass to allow something to gather its status. And I fundamentally disagree with
I think you omitted the most important argument, because that's the argument that I agree with, even though I disagree with the length. We can only define it by looking at what it means in other artistic expressions, which I have chosen to interpret as a masterpiece is recognized by the ripples it causes in its medium.
Right, and so your argument is that we can't judge those ripples without hindsight, yeah?
I think hindsight validates our judgment, yes.
Right, it may validate it, but I don't believe that it's necessary, and I don't believe it's a necessary rubric to say that something is a masterpiece, because I think the point of a masterpiece is that it stands on its own. And whether it affects the things that happen around it is not important. There are games, and there are films, and there are books that haven't been aped by other people, that haven't been copied, that can be considered masterpieces because within their own universe, they're perfect. And so this idea that they need to cause ripples in the industry is a misnomer. And this idea that we need to wait 50 years is a misnomer. And something can burn very bright and very short and still be a masterpiece, but be completely forgotten. There are so many poets that were forgotten until the 20th century. There are so many artists that weren't considered. What is judged a masterpiece is absolutely to do with the mores of our time.
Yeah, exactly. Which is why I don't think it matters. I'm not sure if I made the argument in the topic episode, but I don't think a masterpiece needs to be considered a masterpiece from the moment it's created to now. I don't think something has to be a masterpiece the last 50 years or last 100 years to still be a masterpiece. We can rediscover something, reevaluate it today, and realize, people didn't realize just how fantastic this is because that just wasn't the time for it. Like a masterpiece, ahead of its time, as the phrase apparently goes. And I do agree that I do think that the masterpiece is recognized by how it affects everything else, because if it does not, then I don't really consider it of any value.
Well, that's the point. You don't. I do.
Right.
And he goes on to say later on, in a later post, he goes on to say, let's be objective. Let's not just recommend games that we love as masterpieces. And I disagree with him. The whole point of it, I think you can say, I can't say Go is a fucking masterpiece because I've never played it. I don't think objectivity has any function in judging whether something's a masterpiece. I think the minimum requirement is that you love it. Then you retrofit the masterpiece onto that and say, well, I think I love it, why? And then you break that down and you say, well, I think this conforms to what I would call a masterpiece.
I think the problem here is the use of the term objectivity, because the way I read it, what he's trying to say is pretty much what you just said. The idea of not just going by gut feeling, I like it because I like it, and full stop, this is the end of my argument, but sort of taking a step back and articulating something as to why you like it, why you appreciate it, why it should be valued. And this is sometimes or quite often described as objectivity, and I think you can take issue with that term, but the concept, the core idea is the same, that you try to articulate something, try to rationalize something, try to put up coherent arguments as to why something is good or bad.
You can use evidence to support a subjective argument.
Sure.
Of course you can. And judging the artistic value of something is inherently subjective.
You mean there's no possible evidence that something is of artistic value?
I think when you strip it back, no, I don't think there is. Not in the same way that you can prove that the sun is shining or E equals MC squared. I don't think there is a categorical proof as to whether something has artistic value. All it is you can reinforce your argument and you can hope your argument is watertight, but still fundamental.
Yeah, it's Munchausen's trilemma. Yes, yeah. It's the idea, sure, but that's just a given. Any argument can be broken down to that. But if we look at, we're talking about games, and I think within games, and even if we look at games as art, I think the argument comes back to, does it cause ripples? And if it does, I mean, there must have been something there that sort of made people take notice and make people sort of like, oh, this is good, I want to use this. This sort of generates more creativity,
it's just wrong though. No, it might generate more creativity, but this idea that it create ripples, I play this, it's perfect, it does exactly what it does. It absolutely does not inspire me to do something that apes it. That is fine.
Yes, but then again,
this idea that it creates ripples is fatuous.
But if we're talking about the people who created it, not the people who sort of receive it. If we're talking about art and its value as an art form, it's also about, sit down, have a game, have people sit down who are designers, potential designers, and if they look at this game and go, wow, that's fantastic, this bit, brilliant, it makes me want to do this, it makes me want to, make my own game, it makes me want to start writing graphic novels, makes me want to, sign up for the Peace Corps, I don't know, anything. This is an effect, and it's
But that doesn't denote that it's a bloody masterpiece at all. Shit can make you want to go and improve on it. There can be something that is deeply flawed and deeply doesn't work, but there is some core within it that inspires you to go on. That doesn't mean it's a masterpiece. And anyway...
No, that itself does not, but it does mean it has artistic value, or at least it has value.
The arbiters, also, within human society, now you may disagree whether this is right or not.
I would never disagree with anything you say.
But it's true. The arbiters of whether something is a masterpiece or not are very rarely the artists themselves.
Yes.
It's usually the critics. It is usually people who don't create the art themselves, but put themselves up on a pedestal of being self-appointed experts on the art. Yes, it absolutely is. Yes, it absolutely is.
It's messy.
Critics are the ones who denote whether something's a masterpiece. Anyway, we need to move on.
Yeah.
So we'll finish up with Isaac Shalev, Ender 7. He says he's a game designer, a game publisher, and a kind fortress, Georgios.
Is that the fortress where you don't get, oil poured on top of you if you try to scale it?
Syrup, golden syrup.
Oh.
Lukewarm golden syrup.
That's just... Yeah, that's kind
Imagine.
of... I can sort of see the kindness.
Imagine a gingerbread man breaking into that fortress, Georgios, and then running into your boudoir, and you could just lie in bed munching on his gingery, syrupy goodness all afternoon.
Yeah, next time we're going to record this after lunch.
So, what does he say?
He mentions Hanabi as a masterpiece, a novel mechanism, a solution to the vexing alpha player problem, and a game you can play with grandma or the game group, all for $20 or less. And I think it's quite interesting because I was reminded of Codenames, which is fairly simplistic as well, but both games have in common that once you play it, you think, wow, this is so obvious. Why didn't anybody else think of that before? I mean, it's so blatantly simplistic. I mean, in Hanabi, just turn the cards around and all of a sudden, you can see everybody else's card, and then all of a sudden you can start thinking about how do I tell them which card to play. And with Codenames, it's like, just put out 25 words and you get to give one single clue, and that's it. How do you cover as many of these words as possible? What kind of mental gymnastics do you have to go through to transport this idea, and how can you code it? And it's just so basic, so obvious again, and just blows you away. The simplicity, the something so apparent has only just been discovered, has only just been created. Like somebody coming up with the idea about 100 years ago, like going, did you notice that when you throw an apple into the air, it falls down again? There might be a reason for that.
And this is the thing, isn't it? This Hanabi, Codenames, Werewolf.
All right, yeah.
They put pay to this argument that complexity is necessary for beauty and for profoundness. I think Codenames can be a raucous party game, very thinky, deep trawling of your own ability to connect things. I think Hanabi can be a real sort of revealer of a group dynamic in the same way that Werewolf can. And they're very simple, very elegant ideas. Yeah. And I think complexity and elegance can both be masterpieces. Oh, you don't need to argue about it.
Quite right.
Anyway, Georgios, now I'm going to have one more drinky poo-poos.
Okay. Is that what they call them here now?
Well, that's what some people here call them.
Oh, right, drinky poo-poos. You mean you buy...
It's not poo-poo.
I know. So it's not the Felcher they're selling.
No. Although it is very nice. I had a couple of Felchers last night, right. Which is why I'm having a couple of drinky poo-poos today, because I need to, hair of the dog that bit me, and I was actually bitten by that. Anyway, I'm going to have another couple of drinks, and then I'm going to slip off for a practice.
All right, for practice.
With old tension and release.
All right, some bass slapping.
Because we've got a new gig coming up next week, and we're hoping to, cut some tracks as well.
Okay.
This is what the language I barely understand what they say to me, to be honest.
It's a German accent, isn't it?
That is true. Anyway, so what are you up to now, Jordan?
I'm gonna go get myself something to eat. I'm hungry.
We'll say goodnight then.
Oi, with the poodles already.
Good night.
I'm Nick Mariner, and this segment is all mine. Hello everyone, and welcome back. I'm going to do something a little new and a little self-serving in this week's episode. I'm about to work on a blog post for my own board game blog. You might have heard me mention it before on every episode, ICallYellow at ICallYellow.com, in which I seek to rate all of Uwe Rosenberg's games as solo play experiences. It's a project that's been rattling around in my dumb head for a while now, but I needed to get a few of the games I knew well in group play to the table in solo mode, as all of Uwe's big box games are designed to be enjoyed at a single player count as well. What I'd like to do on this episode, then, is explore some of the reasons I think solo board game play is an exciting and valuable component of our hobby, and also the things I think make a game good as a solitaire exercise. If you're hearing this, I encourage you to check out the upcoming segment on the blog, due to be posted within days of this podcast airing. If you don't feel like it, you don't have to, especially if you aren't into Rosenberg, and you'll get the majority of my thoughts on why I think people solo game here unabridged. If you're listening to this episode as a new listener because I referred you over to us from the blog, welcome aboard. We're all mad here. Now, if you'll indulge me, here goes. Solo gaming is a niche within a niche in this board gaming hobby of ours. Please don't consider this a comprehensive history of the subject, because the fact is I haven't done that kind of research. But obviously there is enough evidence of people engaged in solitary gaming activities to suggest that it has evolved out of a much longer tradition. If you've ever played solitaire or free cell on your PC or with a deck of cards, ever played Tetris or Mario Brothers on the NES by yourself in your bedroom with no one watching, or hit the basketball court at the park alone and played through a dozen fantasies of hitting the gold medal winning shot as a member of the 1992 Dream Team, then being lifted onto the shoulders of Michael Jordan and Larry Bird and telling Christian Laettner he sucks and is hereby off the team, you've engaged in solo play wherein you'll find only yourself and the structure of a game that provides the opponent a series of obstacles to navigate, solve, or utilize toward a maximize or distinctly defined goal. That was too much sentence. However, despite the fact that I estimate most of you listening as having engaged in a version of solo play activity in your lifetime, a targeted community of players that prefer or enjoy games with a player count of 1 is relatively new in the hobby, with game designers putting out games that either reduce down to a single player count or being designed for only 1 player, and podcasts and guilds on BGG devoted to the matter really only proliferating within just the last few years, when folks realized, holy shit, other people like to do this too. Enough to create a market for it anyway. Yet despite the growing popularity of solo gaming, it is by far universally beloved and practiced by the board gaming community as a whole. At least one of our hosts of this show has openly rejected it as part of his gaming patterns. To be honest, I'm not really sure where the Greek stands on the matter. I personally got into solo gaming as a matter of necessity. I discovered my deep and voracious passion for designer board games at a time in my life when I didn't have many people around who shared the love. When I traded in elves and zombies in the typical Ameritrash dice-chucking contests for crops and tiles and heady Eurofare, that number of available game companions got even smaller. With kids in the house, not a ton of free time, and not exactly being stellar at turning complete strangers into new friends, I had 2 choices: play games alone or don't play games at all. There are effectively 2 ways to play board games solo. First, you could set up and play through a game at higher player counts, taking the role of all players at the table. That particular method can be a little difficult if the game is more than a little complex, but not completely uninteresting. Most co-op games can be played this way because all players are seeking the same end anyway. Most of my plays of Pandemic and Ghost Stories have been played in this way, in fact. Of course, some co-ops like the Grizzled or Hanabi require players to navigate hidden information, so that isn't always possible. Side note, the Grizzled has just released a solo mode in the expansion set, which I haven't played but I feel worth mentioning as yet another example of the growing lust we gamers have of playing with ourselves. I was wondering when this segment would get into its first masturbation joke. I held out longer than I thought I would. Just about any game can be played 2- or 3-handed by a player with the time and desire. In fact, I've played almost every game on my shelf in this way because it's part of the process of learning the game in order to teach it. Sometimes I'll do that just because I'm bored, and I have a free afternoon, and no one can meet, and if I don't get Terra Mystica to the table, I'll be forced to strangle someone. Still, that method is cumbersome, and outside the intention of the design, and anymore something I do out of necessity rather than enjoyment. But I will indeed admit that when I pick up a game at the shop or look into it online, it is much more likely to capture my attention if the printed player count on that box begins with the number 1. It won't immediately eliminate a game from my interest if it won't play one player. That would just be silly. Yet if a box suggests that this game I'm holding is available for my group to enjoy, or as a uniquely different and enjoyable experience for playing alone, I'm likely to consider it possibly longer than I should. By that I mean often this consideration backfires, as a game's solo rules seem thrown on unthinkingly in order to sell more copies to a growing solo market when a game just does not function well as a solitaire process. They do this for 2-player counts too. Seven Wonders says 2 players on the box, but it is simply not a 2-player game. The same applies here. Not every game can and should be reduced to a solo count, regardless of how much people like me want it to be so. All this points toward what I'd like to suggest, which is that there are some characteristics good solo games have in common that designers might take into consideration, or that game critics might use to determine if a game is a competent solo creation, or just a multiplayer game being played by one person. First, and probably most importantly, variability is crucial. One of the things I love about solo games, or at least the solo games that I regard most highly, is that they are like constantly shifting puzzles in which the basic structure remains the same, but each game presents a new set of challenges or circumstances to see how efficiently or effectively the puzzle can be solved. It's why I think Robinson Crusoe makes a better solo game than multiplayer, and not just because that makes more thematic sense anyway. But think about this. If you sit in a big comfy armchair working away at a crossword puzzle, you'll enjoy an hour or 2 of figuring out the solutions. Once that puzzle is solved, however, it's done. You don't need to solve it again. That's why they put out a new one every day rather than publishing the same one over and over. I've spoken about variability before on the show, noting that strategic depth provides as much variability as setup. Think chess or Go, which are the same setup every time. In most board games, variability surfaces at the point of player interaction, where reacting to the choices another player makes creates, or at least hopefully creates, new and unique choices in each play. But in a solo game, there is no other player. The game absolutely must offer variable experiences from play to play, or it becomes the old beat-up crossword. Taking a game like Aura et Labora, for instance. At 3 to 4 players, the game is stellar. So many paths to pursue, and so many possible outcomes based on your opponents. The setup of the game, however, is completely static, the exact same in every game. When taking out the other players entirely, that makes the solo version of Aura precisely the same every time you play it. A player might need a few attempts to figure out how to optimize the strategy and hit that 500 points the rule set say is a good mark. But once that's been reached, there is exactly 0 reason to ever play the game again that way. You've solved the puzzle, and it won't be different next time. Spoiler for the blog post, Aura et Labora is not my number 1 solo Uwe game. Here's another suggestion. 1 player means 1 player. If you're thinking of designing a game and want to add a solo variant, I want you to think really hard and really long about whether your game can be engaged by 1 player, or if you have a multiplayer-only game and just plan on asking 1 player to play all the parts. I'm talking about the dummy player mode here. Often games will claim to have a solitaire mode, but really that means a solo player needs to know the game well, then learn another set of rules entirely to program a second artificial player against which she must base all choices in the game. The proverbial ghost man on second. Most of the time, a dummy player in the solo setup is a way of acknowledging that the game is definitely not a solitaire game, but that if you're willing to also take on a pre-programmed, almost entirely predictable fake player, then sure, this game definitely has a one-player count. If I wanted to do that, wouldn't I just play the game two-handed like I mentioned before? I don't want to suggest this has never been done well. The Automa factory that makes solo variants for Stonemaier games builds robot systems that are pretty cool. Although it's worth mentioning, it took me almost as long to learn the solo rules of Scythe as the base game rules. There's a point worth making also. If you absolutely must have a dummy player, and can imagine a fruitful, enjoyable version of a game at one player that still requires one, then that dummy player option should be low on bookkeeping. The focus of a solo game needs to remain the game, not a complex spreadsheet of what the fake player will do on their turn. Solo-specific games like Friday are fun because each turn you flip a card and decide what to do about it based on the context of available resources. A dummy opponent should be some version of that as well, a basic action that a player takes that looks like round setup, followed by a much longer period focused on the player's moves and resources. Race for the Galaxy's first expansion created a robot mat that used dice to sustain unpredictability and, again, variability in what an opponent might do, because that game requires another input source for players to follow or not follow actions. I play it a lot just because Race for the Galaxy is hard to teach, and it doesn't make it to the table often enough, but holy crap, is that robot dense to learn and manipulate. After I played it several times, I got used to the system, and it became much easier to roll the dice and respond accordingly. But it always feels like just a little too much work that takes me away from thinking about what I need to do, and instead hashing out whatever the player who isn't even there is supposed to be doing. Really, that required additional player is a pretty good indication that the game should be played multiplayer, and the solo mode just makes good practice. That brings me to my final suggestion. If you are creating a solo implementation, it should be a game unto itself, not just a practice mode. There are lots of games that have solo counts, but when playing a game on solo, it feels terribly like you're really just doing this to learn the mechanics for when it's eventually played multiplayer, as it should be. Shakespeare and Harbor are two games that immediately come to mind on that point. We gamers who enjoy playing solo games enjoy them because we feel engaged and challenged by them. Practice mode is useful for its own purposes. It really does offer simplified play to learn the mechanics of a game, and as a teacher of most games in our group, I like to feel confident in knowing the game thoroughly. But practice is not play. I don't want to run all day. I want to race. All of this is to say, the solo gaming community within our community is strong and excited. It's funny to see conventions and guilds where people get together to talk about being completely alone. We like it that way because people are horrible. What I want to say is that if you want to make a great solo game, excellent. There is a market of fans who will try it and give good, honest feedback. If your game is really a multiplayer game, that's fine too. Don't force what isn't there to move a few more units by putting a one-player count on the box if that's not really what your thing is about. Because like masturbation, that's just frustrating, debasing, and ultimately not as satisfying as the real thing. I'm Nick Mariner, on Twitter at TheGoodMariner, and my board game blog is iCallYellow at iCallYellow.com. Thanks for listening.
It's crass, unsophisticated, and emotionally manipulative.
It's this week's review. My fellow Americans, we stand united as a nation because we hold certain truths to be self-evident and undeniable to any man, or at least 3/5 of a man, even if the man happens to be a woman, or any other gender. These truths are a right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And it's this pursuit that I want to talk to you about today. People often come up to me and ask me, Mr. President, what should I do with my life? Should I take this job? Should I invest in a huge collection of women's shoes? Should I tackle that great unwritten novel percolating in my head? And I always answer the same. Ask not how others would live your life, but choose for yourself which of these pursuits will make you happy. In the long term, short-term happiness will energize you and might get you out the door first, but it is only long-term happiness that will pay off in the end. That end, when the stresses of daily life and old age cease to us all. So ask yourself, how do you want to spend your time? Do you wish to amass bigger and better things? Will you throw yourself into one activity after another? Will you follow the footsteps of your forebearers and pursue the family life? Or will you dedicate yourself to personal projects and create something of value? Your time on this earth is limited, so use it wisely. And one last thing. Live from New York, it's Saturday night! What do you mean this isn't SNL? Then why am I screaming?
Yeah, skip to the end.
It's the one-sentence review.
The pursuit of happiness succeeds in its aim. I pursued it, and at the end I was happy. But was that enough?
The pursuit of happiness is a leisurely stroll through the park, during which you are far more concerned with smelling the flowers than getting to the end.
George Oz? Ooh, what's that in the corner of the room?
I don't know, but it's eating peanuts with its nose.
So the elephant in the room is, George Oz, is this just the game of life with action selection?
Yes.
So, what did you think of my interactive, candid photo montage?
Well, it was certainly an experience.
Alright, usually I ask you what your experience is.
Yes.
I'm going to open with my experience.
That's a good plan.
Just this time. For changes.
Yes. Changes.
That's right. You should really see someone about that stutter, Georgios.
All right. It's just with this word, though. Changes.
Really strange, that. Do you think it's a psychological thing?
Nah, see, I tried turning, facing the strange things, but it didn't work.
Do you think you were threatened with a Bowie knife as a youth?
Possibly.
So, I was unsure about this game. Mm-hmm. Because this is a game in which the story is paramount.
Yeah.
And I think games that are not theme necessarily, this is specifically story. Mm-hmm. The narrative of what happens through your life. And I was concerned that the focus would be on the story and not on the structure of the game.
Okay.
Story without structure is flabby and uninteresting.
Right.
But I was surprised that there are decisions to be made in this game. It's not, and they call it the game of life for gamers. And that's trite. And sounds a little fatuous.
Yeah.
But it's kind of right, though, isn't it?
It is kind of right. I think the most interesting thing about the game, especially its narrative, is that it does something that I don't see a lot of other games do, which ostensibly deal with narrative, in that your decisions are quite literally the plot points of the story you're telling.
Right.
Every decision you take is basically how you or your character takes the next step to do the next thing, to do the next thing. It's quite literally basically a long list of causes, of actions causing other actions, allowing other actions until you get to the end. So you have basically a narrative structure that is similar to a proper story. You could argue about the arc itself, but at the end, it's basically you do this, so you can do this, so you can do this, so you can do this. And along the way, you collect happiness points, I think long-term happiness, which I think halfway through I kind of forgot about. Because
it becomes points, of course.
Yeah.
As in all of these games, renown, respect, fame, whatever they call them, they're essentially points, and you're getting points. But what I'm really interested in this game is, I think, the clever idea. Mm-hmm. Now, I don't know which of the designers came up with this idea, but they should be the one that should be slapped on the back and given a lot of credit, I think, because the central currency, because it could have been very easy, especially in our society in which we put so much emphasis on how much money you have. It could have been very easy to have the victory condition being money at the end of the game, right?
Right, yeah.
But the central currency of the game isn't money. Mm-hmm. It's time. And I think that tells you a lot about actually what goes into making a successful life is putting the bloody time in.
I think this
you know what I mean?
Exactly. No, I think this is very, very central to, I think, the core appeal of this game, because more so than many other games we've talked about on the show, I think this is a deeply, I'm going to say, political game, because it is about certain cultural ideas, certain ideals as well, about how we live our lives. And one of the things, small details which are arguably simplification for gaming's sake, but I think which are intentional, is that you do not have strong random effects changing the course of your actions. Basically, if you choose to write your novel, the only thing keeping you from becoming a bestseller is the time you put in.
Right.
The only thing keeping you from becoming a world-renowned, cook or something, or traveling around the world. It's just, if you put in the time to get what you need, you can do this. There's nothing, again, it's basically political. It all comes down to your choices, not to outside random effects. It all comes down to the fact that if you put in the work, you will get your reward, which is a deeply calming and a deeply enjoyable fantasy, which is why I think this game has a strong draw to it.
And I think like a lot of sort of abstracted political points, it sacrifices realism to get its argument across.
Yeah.
And you say you get your reward. The reward ain't money.
Yes.
Money is to facilitate happiness.
Mm-hmm.
And we conflate money with happiness so much in our society.
Yeah.
And I think not having to stress about paying bills, not having to stress about getting through life, taking away financial worry is a great thing. Mm-hmm. But money doesn't, and it's trite, money doesn't bring you happiness. All it does
yes.
is facilitate that pursuit.
Exactly. Though, small detail, just, in case we have nitpickers among the audience, at the end of the game, you do get some sort of additional happiness points for whatever leftover money you have. I think it's 5-1. So it's for every 5 points of money you have, you get 1 point of happiness because you can bequeath it to your progeny. I don't know. Which, again, it's a nice idea, but that's really a moment where the gamey elements really shine through. But the game itself, when you look at the display of what you can do, what you can choose to do, what you can pursue, it is explicitly empowering. It's explicitly optimistic. It's never about putting something in your way to keep you from getting what you want. It's always about, right, I choose this path. I want to pursue this way to happiness. And there's something very, just talking about it just makes me smile. Because
now that's wrong, right? That's wrong. Sometimes life's unfair. Sometimes luck is a factor. Sometimes things happen. People get cancer. People die, right?
Yes. All of these things are not part of the game. It's very much an ideal fantasy of how happy life can be.
And I don't have an issue with it not reflecting that. Why? Because I think it's much more of a political statement than it is a game in many ways. And I think that's political debate is all about wanting to convey the point you want to convey.
Right.
And leaving out. They're not lying exactly. They're just omitting. I don't believe putting the time in will always get you what you want.
Yeah.
But it's not a bad credo to live by, right?
Yes, I agree. I think that's, ultimately, this is the fantasy, like I said, this game wants to create, and this is basically the experience you're going to have. You're going to have 90 minutes of living this rom-com style, sitcom style fantasy of life paying off, of doing what you are passionate about, making you happy, giving you a fulfilled life. And if this, I think literally this is the main draw of the game, and a lot of the flubbiness or like the simplicity in the game design we're going to talk about later, sort of is diminished in my view because it doesn't seem to play that much of a role, because the experience you get from playing the game, it just leaves me, every time I played it, it left me with a smile. It left me with a nice little story. Like the first game we played, I went from, you start as a teenager, then you have like 5 turns of being an adult. And right from I started off as a teenager. My first turn, a job was available as the president. President is one of the jobs you can take. I took the president job. Eats up a lot of time, pays off so much money, but it was just it was hilarious to the entire table as some kid straight out of high school becoming the president, sort of ending the turn, and then the rest of the game, I had no money problems. I just bought whatever I wanted and went on these crazy cruises, went on TV shows and reality shows and wrote a book. It was just all these small elements, bits and pieces that sort of create this narrative in your head. And if there's one thing I would nitpick about the game, which with the tagline, it has the tagline, live the life you want to live. I would nitpick, you don't so much live a life as you create this amusing little character.
Right. It's a narrative game that tells a story, a coherent story that is very sweet.
Alright, so how about this? You take a tenuous grasp of reality,
a lot of condescension, at least 4 cups, and a slow-wittedness masked through pretensions of prolixity.
Well, that's you, isn't it?
Yeah, it's design.
Now, the design part is what I'm interested in, because as I say, I didn't think it was going to be a game.
All right.
I thought it was going to be, you do this, you read something out of a book or whatever, those sort of storytelling games that masquerade as games. They're not really games, they're...
That's a topic waiting to happen, but
they're choose your own adventure bullshit, right? But this has all the trappings of a Euro game. It has worker placement. It has action selection. It has upkeep. You've got to plan to make sure you have the resources to not get fired from your job.
Yeah, I like that.
But what's really, really clever, and this is why when people draw this distinction between thematic games and Euro games, it drives me up the bloody wall.
Yeah.
Because being a Euro game and using rigorous Euro game mechanics does not necessarily mean it's not thematic. And this game is inherently thematic. Everything you do, apart from the coins at the end, and that's just a gamery thing that seems tacked on, everything you do is thematic, right?
Yeah, I agree. I think most of the rules are there to sort of transport this idea of having responsibilities, basically. I like the relationship mechanic. You have, most of the cards have various levels. The first time you pick them up, they're on level 1. They usually don't cost any upkeep. They give you small rewards. But later on, you can either improve them or redo them, but in a bigger, more expensive version. So in a relationship, obviously you can improve. You can start dating, costs you nothing, gives you a little bit of, usually some sort of happiness. But then you can start getting into a relationship. And this is one of the quite elegant ways in which the main resource is sort of taken away from you, in that a relationship costs time. You start off with 6 action tokens each turn, hourglasses, I think. If you are in a dedicated relationship, which is level 2, you need to spend 1 time token is immediately taken away from you because a relationship takes time.
You need to put that time into the relationship.
Exactly. And if you want to actually have a family with that person, you can have a second level. You can improve that. In this case, it takes two points of your time.
And that's the same with jobs.
Yes.
You get a promotion, it takes more time.
The higher paying the job, the more time it costs. Yes.
Yeah, and this is really clever because then you're asked to make one of these life choices.
Exactly.
Do I need to dedicate my time to my work, or can I just dispense with it and do something that's easier, ostensibly less important, but it gives me more time? But then again, what am I doing with that time?
Exactly.
Is going canoeing a valuable use of my time, or is it better just put on the job? Is it better put into the kids? That's really clever, I think.
It is. I think, and there's a lot of really small, nice ideas packaged within the game, like the fact that, the relationship cards are double-sided. They are the same, on both sides as in what they pay out when you engage them. They're just male or female, and there's nobody is asking you to pick the so-called appropriate gender.
Right.
You just pick whichever gender you want, and this is your partner. And if you want to sort of break off the relationship because it doesn't make you happy or happy enough, it costs you a bit of short-term happiness, sort of slowing things down a bit because, you're a bit of a slump emotionally. And I think causes a bit of stress because, breakups are hard. All these things, pretty much every rule in this game has an apparent thematic explanation.
Right.
And this is just, for some reason, this kind of appeals to my ludologically aesthetic side, ludo-aesthetically side, whatever it is. To me, this is how not all games, but a certain number of rules should function in a game. They should transport the setting they're trying to be in.
I like cleverness. I like to see something and go, wow, that was thought out.
Yeah.
And that was put together well. And that idea is clever. What I like about this game is that you have this central conceit of, we'll spend time. That can be thought up in the time it takes to say it, right?
Right.
But great ideas don't make great works. Those ideas then need to be integrated and built upon, and they need to function within the whole.
Right.
And it does here.
Yes.
Kind of everything you do suggests that you're taking up more time, you're freeing more time. Then do you have too much time? Sometimes you don't have the money to be able to do the things.
Exactly.
Or the resources to be able to do the things. Therefore you have too much time and you end up, wishing, I wish I'd put more time into my job now.
Right.
Because I'm just sat here watching YouTube and masturbating.
That was a very
That's a Kickstarter card.
Yeah, actually, speaking of Kickstarter cards, I do want to mention some of the elements. Most of them are nice additions that do not fundamentally change the game. There are pets, which are amusing because slightly morbid. I don't actually have never had a pet, but still slightly morbid that all pets eventually die before you do, usually. And they all cost you short-term happiness because you're sad.
But I like that they give you long-term happiness.
They give you long-term happiness.
Because you live off the memories of that
Exactly,
pet.
exactly. And it all ends with very, very touching, with the last, like in relationships, you have dating, you have relationship, you have family. In pets, you have like, I don't know, level 1, level 2, depending on how old they are. And then it always ends with goodbye, friend. And that's touching.
And it's nice that, you don't really need to invoke Mariner's Law here, particularly.
No, not at all.
Because it's given to you.
Quite. Yeah. It's all there. It's basically, I think some of the other elements that are included in there are kind of tacked on, like the Kickstarter extras, like, the trends. Apparently you can have trends in your lifetime. And if you get a certain bonus, if you complete certain projects of a certain type, which is really purely gamery. And just a way to sort of re-tact on.
But fundamentally, it's not a novel, right? Fundamentally, It's not a documentary. Fundamentally, it's a game. It needs gamery elements to make it a game. And why I wasn't disappointed and why I expected to be was because I expected there to be no game.
Right.
I expected to be a nice hippy-dippy exercise, and it's not. It's actually a game. It's not the heaviest game in the world.
No, not at all.
It's not a super crunchy Euro. And what's really nice, because of the story it tells, and because of the way that is conveyed to the mechanics, it's a nice game, too. And you don't really care who wins at the end.
Yeah.
Which for a Euro game is unique, I think.
That's probably true, yeah. I think most of the time it's just, again, it's sort of the interplay of these various rules elements, like you have short-term happiness, which if you're happy in your life, you have an easier time dedicating time, getting your projects done. If you're unhappy for whatever reason, you have a harder time to do that. And they're also nicely integrated, but not so far as to have you sit down and figure out complex equations of how do I get from here to there, which is a challenge, appealing challenge all on its own. But this game does not thrive on that. This game thrives on the joy of choosing. I want to be a writer. I want to develop a board game. One of the funny, again, a lot of little gags in there. Like you can have a board game collection, which for some reason the illustrations is full of Artipia Games. No connection apparently. You can go to a board game fair. The smallest level is your local con. Then it's the city con. And then it's Essen, obviously, which is the highest level of visiting a board game fair. All these kind of things. They're just all these nice little moments that trigger that you do need you need to struggle a tiny little bit to get there. Enough to make you feel like it wasn't random, but not so much as to be really difficult.
My only quibble, and this is the only one, I think the game is good, is I think they went a little too far in avoiding the darkness.
Mm-hmm.
There's no sex in there, really. It's implied.
Yeah.
There's no pain. And, and as I said earlier, I think it's as much a political statement as it is a game, so they want to omit that.
Yeah.
To get a point across, which is fine. But I like my art to be fully rounded. And I'm not saying that you need it to be dark and tortured, but I think they could have hinted a bit more at the fact that sometimes life just ain't bloody fair.
That's right, but remember that we have to keep in mind we're talking about a board game ostensibly aimed at gamers, and gamers hate moments that are unfair. But even then, I think there's small implicit moments of, not quite happiness, like pets dying, like the fact that everybody dies at the end, which actually I don't find it that dark for some reason.
You don't die at the end though, do you really? You just have too much stress and that's it. And they kind of say you die, but it doesn't feel like death. It feels like the game ends.
Yes,
that's what it
true.
feels like.
Well, there are some moments of implied darkness in the events deck, which is a Kickstarter extra, which basically you flip over a card, something will happen at the beginning of next turn, and you can either prevent it or ensure it depending on whether it's good or bad. And some of the bad things that happen are ostensibly, dark. There's there are natural catastrophes.
Financial crisis.
There's a financial crisis because it is a Greek game. There are other things that can happen that, again, I agree with you that the darker elements are kept out on purpose. I think partly because of the political statement and partly because I think most gamers would be really mad if you suddenly introduce random elements.
And also there's this idea that games are supposed to be fun and they're not supposed to be art. And I kind of understand that. Well, yeah. I just like a bit of miserable in my fun.
Playing this made me want to play. Right, so speaking of darkness, the game that it made me want to play, for basically the same reason, is Funny Friends by Friedemann Friese, or in German it's called Fiese Freunde, Fette Feten, which is, I don't know, funnier for some reason, which includes pretty much allegedly darker elements. You can, you have more sex, far more sex in this game, with either your own, with members of your gender or members of the opposite gender, or both, or even sometimes with the other players, but not literally, just, in the game. And, you can actually start families with other players. You are far more involved with other players, and the projects and the goals you try to achieve are a bit cheekier, a bit funnier. The humor is just strongly skewed. Like you have, I think, you can join a cult, and the illustration for joining a cult is basically somebody with an Apple laptop, and you can end up being addicted to drugs. You can end up being miserable. You can end up divorced. You can all these kinds of things.
You see, I haven't played this, but that strikes me as a more interesting story.
It is interesting. Unfortunately, the rules are 80% fine and 20% a mess. They're like, there's one of the core elements of interaction is phoning in, I think, more or less. And I've played, I think, half a dozen times, and I still don't know how those rules work. Each time I read them and go, I don't understand them. There's something about when you can sort of you can spend a token and then somebody else gets it, and then you can join in, but it's not quite clear how you can join in on somebody else's activity, or how you can it's all very, very messy. And it sort of screams for a second edition, or revised edition at least. And it's much more involved in what you try to do. You spend much more time just gaining the resources you need to get to sort of play the cards you want. You spend far more time doing things you need, and far less time just doing fun things with your character.
Right. The game that it made me want to play it has similar elements of sort of mortality and things. Mm-hmm. Though I think the game itself is a little more sort of in my wheelhouse, sort of a bit crunchier. Mm-hmm. But also the humour's a bit funnier, and it's a bit more edgy. And this seems strange, but it's Dungeon Pets.
Oh, right. Okay.
And Dungeon Pets, what you're dealing with is this notion of bringing up these lovely animals that are clearly there to be used as guard dogs and murderous things to sell to evil people. And it's playing on those tropes of fantasy.
Right.
But it also deals with the fact that you're having to raise these things, give these things love, and then sell them. Mm-hmm. And I think that is interesting. You have these cute things that you're raising for business.
Right.
And it's slightly darker.
Not slightly.
Less candy-coated, and I think is a bit more challenging. And while I think The Pursuit of Happiness is a wonderful Sunday afternoon movie, Dungeon Pets is a bit more anarchic, a bit crunchier, and Funny Friends sounds, downright Friday night to me.
Yeah, pretty much, yeah.
So, to sum up.
Yes, let's sum up.
Should people go out and buy Pursuit of Happiness?
I'm going to lean towards yes, and I'm just going to repeat what I just said. It's nice, it's cozy, it's fun, it's not too overwhelming. It's a great game to play with somebody who's just sort of finding the way around board games. It will not be like a milestone of design, other than simply design getting out of the way of the experience. I'd struggle to find a game that is just equally as meaty as a game as it is relaxing and enjoyable, because you don't have like bullshit random dice rolls and stuff like that, which I usually love, but can be really frustrating if you just want to have something nice happen. I think what it comes down to is when you hear a game described as just being a nice and pleasant experience, if you're looking for something like that, you should buy Pursuit of Happiness. If for some reason you don't want that kind of thing, which is fair enough, I don't think it's a milestone, yeah?
Pursuit of Happiness is nice, but that's not damning it with faint praise. It's pleasant. It's enjoyable. It's a proper game that tells a proper story, but it manages to utilize Euro mechanics without leveraging the competitiveness. And for that reason alone, I think it's worth having. like a mote in the air, caught in a sunbeam. It is fleeting, Georgios. It seems only a second ago we started recording, and now it's over.
Maybe no drinks for you when we record then. You get very morose towards the end.
Give us the deets.
Fine. You can visit our website at infoperfected.com, where we now have started to post stuff that isn't just the podcast. We started writing things. We will continue to write things, and somebody else might as well. Ooh, spoilers. Then we have Instagram, where we take pictures of... No, unfortunately it's not a junk. No, it's just the games. Pictures of games we play, or we have on the table, or anything we can think of that has to do with games. You can find us at Perfect Information, our board game geek guild, which is the Guild of Perfect Information, at number 2348. Do join us. People like to talk about it. Well, us mostly, but people like to talk within the guild, and we're happy to hear more people talk about how much they fancy us. And then there's Twitter. There is Info Perfected, which is mostly used by Ben. There's now Perfected Info, which is used exclusively by me.
I don't agree with this.
Yeah, he doesn't agree with it. And then we have... What else did I forget? We're on iTunes. Oh yes, speaking of iTunes, do leave us a review, because we don't have any.
None. I mean, literally none. Go on iTunes, review us.
Please do.
Say we're great.
Yes, or be honest. I think that's basically it, isn't it?
And so, as the world turns and fires burn, what you learn is to gurn and churn. Say goodnight, Georgios.
Oi, with the poodles already.